On April 23, 1996, the body of 19-year-old Stacy Stites was found off of a desolate stretch of road in Bastrop County, Texas. Stacy was reported missing when she failed to arrive for her 3:30 a.m. shift at HEB. Investigators soon found her fiance's truck, which Stacy had taken to work, abandoned in the parking lot of the Bastrop County High School. Stacy was discovered later that day. She had been brutally beaten, raped, and strangled. The Texas Rangers took the lead on the investigation and soon zeroed in on Stacy's fiancé, Jimmy Fennell. However, the semen taken from Stacy didn't match Fennell, and the timeline never added up. It was 30 miles from where Stacy's body was found to the apartment she shared with Fennell, and Stacy had taken the couple's only vehicle to work. In addition to Fennell, investigators took DNA samples from every man who had been in contact with Stacy to compare against the unknown profile. None were matches. 7 months passed with few promising leads, but just when it seemed the case would go cold, investigators got a break. The DNA was matched to a man named Rodney Reed. When Reed was brought in for questioning, he claimed not to know Stacy, insisting he only knew about the case from the news. After confronting him with the DNA evidence, police arrested Reed and charged him with the rape and murder of Stacy Stites. Reed went on trial in 1998, where his attorney finally attempted to explain the presence of his semen inside of a murdered woman. Reed and Stacy, she claimed, were involved in a secret relationship. It was so secret, in fact, that no one apart from Rodney could verify its existence. The jury didn't buy it. Reed was found guilty and sentenced to die by lethal injection. He's been on death row ever since. Now, I've kept up with Rodney's case for years, and I'm aware that he's always had his supporters. But I also thought the evidence against Reed was so convincing that no one could really believe that he's innocent. But I guess I gave people too much credit. Not only are there people who genuinely believe Rodney Reed is innocent, but their numbers are growing at an alarming rate. To be fair, however, Reed's attorneys have crafted a good story. They present Reed as a tragic figure, railroaded by a corrupt, racist police department for the crime of dating a white woman in Texas. The defense's theory of the crime can be summed up roughly as Jimmy Fennell in the apartment with the belt. Supposedly, he learned about the relationship and strangled Stacy in a jealous, bigoted rage. Jimmy then used his knowledge as a police officer to concoct an alibi, stage a crime scene, and remove all evidence of his involvement. The trial, according to this narrative, was equally unfair. Reed's fate was sealed from the beginning by a small-town judge and an all-white jury who were blinded to the possibility of an interracial relationship. The story hits all the right notes. Corrupt police, an innocent minority, racist white people, and a justice system without the justice. Now, to be clear, I don't blame Reed's attorneys. Their job is to vigorously defend their client, and that's what they've done. I do, however, blame celebrities like Kim Kardashian, Oprah Winfrey, and Rihanna, who have used their influence to rally millions of morons to Reed's defense. But most of all, I blame the media for acting as stenographers for Reed's defense. Even with the very low expectations I have for journalists, their coverage of the case has been shockingly bad. Nearly without exception, the articles written about Rodney Reed parrot the defense's propaganda. As a result, it's almost impossible to find accurate information about the murder of Stacy Stites. This blitzkrieg of pro-Reed spin has already succeeded in halting his execution. But his supporters have no intentions of stopping there. The movement to free Rodney Reed from prison is in full swing and gaining new support every day. This can't be allowed to happen. Rodney Reed isn't a symbol of racial injustice. He's a serial rapist, a murderer, and a pathological liar. So if you're more interested in the truth than in Twitter likes, then stick around for the side of the story that you won't get from the media. Let's begin with the notion that Rodney was somehow targeted because of his race. For all the talk about racism, Reed supporters are surprisingly light on details when it comes to how Rodney actually became a suspect in Stacy's death. And with good reason. It's devastating to their case. 7 months after Stacy's murder, Reed still wasn't on investigators' radar. That is, until a woman named Linda Schluter told police a strikingly familiar story.
A young Austin woman named Linda Schluter was visiting friends here in Bastrop around midnight when she stopped to use a payphone at this now closed gas station. It was while she was using the phone that she says a tall black man approached her asking for a ride.
I was only 19 at the time. So I was like, "Where do you live?" And he said, "On Main Street." And in my mind, Main Street's this big lit up road. So I was like, "Oh, well, how far?" And he said, "A mile or 2.
Linda drove and says when he tried guiding her down a dirt road, she refused and turned the car around.
The next thing I know, he has me by the back of my hair, slamming my face on my steering wheel.
Linda says she kept trying to fight back.
And I asked him, I was like, "What do you want? What the hell do you want from me?" And he said, "I want a blowjob." And I said, "You'll have to kill me if you get anything from me." And he said, "I guess I have to kill you then."
Still fighting, Linda says he tried to take her in the car, but when she saw lights approaching, she jumped out and says he took off in her car, leaving her to run for help.
They called the cops came, and I identified who it was, exactly what he was wearing, where I picked him up, what time it was.
So as you can see, the similarities between these two cases, not racism, led investigators to Rodney Reed. After Linda picked Reed out of a lineup, investigators decided to check with the Department of Public Safety to see if Reed's DNA was on file. As it happens, it was, from a prior allegation that he had raped and physically abused his mentally disabled girlfriend, Caroline Rivas. Yeah, just let that sink in. So contrary to the narrative, a prior rape allegation, not his skin color or police racism, led investigators to Rodney Reed. Next, let's put to bed the idea that Jimmy Fennell was involved in Stacy's murder. Jimmy was the obvious suspect. He was both Stacy's fiancé and the last person who saw her before she left for work. It's also true that he failed 2 polygraph examinations, as Reed supporters are fond of reminding us. Of course, if they're that confident in polygraph results, it seems strange that Reed hasn't taken one. Just saying. Fennell was such an obvious suspect that investigators tried to make a case against him even after his semen failed to match what was found inside of Stacy. Detectives definitely considered and pursued the jealous lover angle, but it never added up. Stacy's own mother, who lived underneath the couple, says she heard Stacy leave for work that morning. This corroborates Fennell's version of events and makes sense considering Stacy was found in her work uniform. But the timeline was the real problem for investigators. They put Stacy's time of death at around 3 a.m., and there simply wasn't enough time for Fennell to have killed Stacy, dumped her body, left the truck at the high school, and walked the 30-plus miles back to the apartment the couple shared to receive the call from Stacy's mother at 6:45. Even if you accept the defense's claim that Stacy died closer to midnight, it still doesn't work. Of course, the timeline problem only means that Fennell couldn't have killed Stacy without either an accomplice or an alternative means of transportation. Ranger Wardlow considered both of these possibilities. First, he looked into whether Fennell could have used Carol's Ford Tempo to commit the crime, but learned that Fennell had to pick up the keys from Carol the following morning to go look for Stacy. Wardlow also looked at taxi records and examined the mileage on every vehicle owned by the Giddings police. Again, he found nothing. He then turned to potential accomplices. Fennell's friends, including fellow officers, all had sound alibis and were cleared by DNA. Jimmy Fennell is not a good person. In fact, he spent time in prison for raping a woman while on duty. But just because Fennell is a terrible person doesn't mean he murdered Stacy. Of course, the fact that Fennell couldn't have committed the crime hasn't stopped people from coming forward over the years claiming to have evidence of his involvement. And while they bring nothing of substance to the case, I've selected a couple just to give you an idea of how low the bar is to be a witness for Reed's defense. Basically, if you can sign an affidavit without drooling on it, they'll take you. We'll begin with Martha Barnett. She claimed to have seen Jimmy and Stacy arguing outside of the Old Frontier store next to a red pickup truck sometime between 5 and 5:30 a.m. on the morning of Stacy's death. She says she immediately recognized Stacy, but didn't learn that the man was Fennell until she saw his picture in the Giddings Times a couple of weeks later. Obviously, if true, this would almost certainly make Fennell the killer. But it's irrelevant because Barnett's story is pure fiction. At an evidentiary hearing, Barnett testified about seeing Stacy and Fennell arguing outside of the Old Frontier, but changed the time from between 5 and 5:30 a.m. to 4:45. The state then proceeded to comprehensively rip this testimony to pieces. The prosecution first zeroed in on Barnett's change of time. You see, Fennell's truck was initially found at the high school at 5:23, which was 25 minutes from the Old Frontier. So Barnett couldn't have seen Stacy and Fennell when she originally claimed to. It's almost like she was told this and changed her story to account for the new information. But it gets worse. Remember how Barnett claimed to have recognized Fennell from a photo in the Giddings Times? Well, the state presented Barnett with every issue of the Giddings Times, dated from when Stacy's body was found to the day after Reed's sentencing, and asked her to identify which one contained the picture of Fennell, which she claimed had jogged her memory. Barnett was forced to admit that none of the issues contained a photo of Fennell. Ouch. But believe it or not, it actually gets worse still. It turns out that Barnett had 2 pending court dates, one for theft and another for a DWI. The arresting officer for both infractions? Jimmy Fennell. Under cross-examination, Barnett admitted that she was angry about the arrests and knew Fennell would testify against her if the cases went to trial. So to recap, Barnett altered the time that she supposedly witnessed these events, lied about how she recognized Fennell, and neglected to mention that she had a huge grudge against the man. And just so we're perfectly clear, Barnett is one of the most commonly cited witnesses from Reed's defenders. This is some of the best evidence they have for Fennell's involvement, which you might think would tell them something. Which of course it didn't. Next was Arthur Snow Jr., a once high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood who spent time in prison with Fennell. According to Snow, he knew Fennell because the Brotherhood was providing him protection for a fee. He claims that Fennell told him that he was forced to kill his, quote, in-loving fiancée because she was sleeping around with a black man behind his back. Snow says he came forward after seeing a newspaper article about Rodney while locked up in Hays County Jail. After some soul-searching, he decided it was his moral obligation to come forward with what he knows. But it seems that Arthur the Friendly Aryan might have had a motive other than justice for an innocent black man. Now I know what you're thinking. If you can't trust the violent racial supremacist head of a prison gang, then who can you trust? But as hard as it is to believe, Arthur might not have had Rodney's best interest at heart. You see, the Brotherhood learned that Jimmy Fennell was a former cop and a rapist and stopped offering him protection. In retaliation, Jimmy accused the Brotherhood of extortion. As a result, Arthur was shipped off to a new prison in an effort to break up the gang. Now you're free to believe whatever you like, but ask yourself what's more likely. A member of the Aryan Brotherhood coming forward to save the life of an innocent black man, or a bitter gang member getting revenge on a snitch who had him sent to another prison. I'll skip the Jeopardy music. In fairness, this is the one area where Reed's defenders have some legitimate concerns. A key issue at trial was when Rodney's semen found its way inside of Stacy. This is important because the defense maintains that Reed and Stacy were involved in a consensual relationship. and that the two had sex the day before Stacy's death. So when the semen was deposited was central to the case. Medical evidence that Rodney's semen was deposited around the time of Stacy's death would strongly suggest that Rodney is the killer. On the other hand, evidence the semen was deposited much earlier could help confirm Rodney's account. At trial, the state relied on 3 expert witnesses to show that Rodney's semen was deposited at the time of Stacy's death: state medical examiner Dr. Robert Bayardo, crime scene investigator Karen Blakely, and serologist Megan Clement. Reed's defense, however, claims that the state's case hinged on inaccurate and misleading scientific information. And to be honest, there were real problems with the state's medical evidence. First, Dr. Bayardo has expressed concerns with how his testimony was used at trial. He claims the state didn't properly convey to the jury that his 3 a.m. time of death was only an estimate. Quote, "My estimate of time of death, again, was only an estimate, and should not have been used at trial as an accurate statement of when Miss Stites died." He also expressed doubts about the testimonies of Blakely and Clement. Quote, "Miss Blakely testified that spermatozoa can remain intact in the vaginal cavity for no more than 26 hours. And Miss Clement testified that spermatozoa can remain intact for no more than 24 hours. I question the qualifications of these witnesses to offer this testimony, and in any event, they are incorrect. I am personally aware of medical literature finding that spermatozoa can remain intact in the vaginal cavity for days after death." Bayardo no longer even believes Stacy was raped. Quote, "There's no evidence that the spermatozoa in Miss Stites' vaginal cavity was placed there in any manner other than consensually." Reed's defense argues that these errors were central to the jury's verdict, and the prosecution certainly seems to have stressed the misleading evidence at trial. In fact, the inaccurate lifespan for spermatozoa was brought up 3 times in the closing arguments alone. So there's no doubt that the jury was given inaccurate information. And if we stopped there, it may seem as though Reed got a raw deal after all. But it's important to keep a few things in mind. To begin with, just because the semen could have been deposited earlier doesn't mean that it was. And although the prosecution overstated the medical evidence, the jury was aware that the semen deposit and time of death could have occurred earlier. Reed's own medical expert, Dr. Johnson, cited research that shows that spermatozoa can remain intact in the vaginal cavity for more than 26 hours. And on cross-examination, Dr. Bayardo was asked whether calculating time of death is an exact science. He replied, quote, "No, it's not a precise scientific way of making a determination of the time of death. We can only make estimates." During the trial, Blakely conceded that components of semen can be found within the vaginal cavity for up to 120 days. And Clement merely said that in her experience, she didn't recall having found intact sperm more than 20 to 24 hours after a sexual assault. She never put a definitive time limit on it. And as far as Bayardo's new opinion that Stacy wasn't raped, considering the condition of her body, the broken zipper, and the pants below her waist, I can't even take that opinion seriously. But there's a much more important fact that Reed supporters tend to ignore. The semen wasn't the only biological evidence. Stacy was found with Reed's saliva on her breast, which doesn't really fit with the two having sex the day before. There's just not a good explanation here. Either Rodney left it when he murdered Stacy, or Stacy, who was supposedly hiding an affair, just decided not to wash it off. I guess it was sentimental value, huh? It's clear which the jury thought was more likely. Look, there's a reason that despite the errors made by the prosecution, that Rodney's appeals have been repeatedly rejected at both the state and federal levels. It's highly unlikely that even without these errors, any rational jury would have found Reed innocent.
Now Reed's lawyers are pushing for the murder weapon to be tested for DNA.
The state has fought for years to prevent us from testing the one item that really could determine who committed this crime, and that's the belt that was used to strangle Stacy.
At first glance, the defense's request to test the physical evidence, particularly the belt used to strangle Stacy, seems reasonable. If the state cared about the truth, surely it would welcome DNA testing, right? After all, if prosecutors are so certain that the right man is behind bars, what's the problem? But of course, it's not that simple. Reed's attorney is being incredibly disingenuous. To begin with, the same items Reed now claims are the keys to his exoneration were available to test at trial, and Reed decided against it. As to why, we can only speculate. The reason DNA testing has been mostly denied since the trial is that the majority of items have been contaminated. The items were touched at trial by any number of people, including the jurors, prosecutors, and Rodney's defense. After the trial, the items spent years jumbled together in a box inside of an evidence room. And while that might make today's forensic analysts cringe, it was perfectly consistent with the practices of the day. It wasn't until years later, long past the time that DNA would offer any probative value, that Reed suddenly demanded it. The reality is that DNA testing, especially on the belt, would tell us absolutely nothing. And that's exactly why Reed is requesting it. Just think about it. If Fennell's DNA is found, great. It shouldn't surprise anyone that his DNA would be on his wife's belt, but that won't stop Rodney's defenders from declaring him exonerated. If Rodney's DNA is found, no big deal. After all, they were in a consensual relationship, right? And if some random third party's DNA is found, well, that's fine too. The absence of Rodney's DNA will certainly help with the propaganda. So you see, whatever the outcome, Rodney wins. And of course, that's always been the point. His attorney knows good and well that DNA testing on the belt would tell us nothing. Otherwise, he wouldn't be requesting it. But something Reed's fan club doesn't often mention, for good reason, is that the state did actually agree to test certain items back in 2014. The results?
Reed's lawyers with the Innocence Project also pushed for further DNA testing on Stacy in 2015. And in the state's advisory, it shows advanced DNA testing revealed more of Reed's DNA on Stacy in her vagina, anus, and underwear, and mixed with Stacy's DNA on her pants and on her back brace, which was found in her truck.
We've done DNA testing, and all it's done is further solidify that Rodney Reed is responsible for her murder.
Yeah, I'd keep whining about the belt too. Finally, we come to the crux of the entire case. Was Rodney Reed having a consensual affair with Stacy Stites? Ultimately, this is the only question that matters. If Reed can't demonstrate this relationship, then all the talk about time of death and DNA is meaningless because there's no reason for Reed's semen to be inside of Stacy in the first place. Given that this is the most important question in the case, I don't simply want to give you my conclusion. I want you to reach your own. I'm going to present you with the same evidence that Rodney's jurors heard and let you decide whether this relationship was real. Feel free to take notes. It's important that you make an informed decision. So let's begin. The defense's first witness was Iris Lindley, who testified that someone who resembled Stacy, but might have been named Stephanie, once came by Reed's house to ask if he was home. Next came family friend Julia Estes. In her testimony, she claimed to have once seen Reed and Stacy speaking together at HEB. And we're done. Congratulations. You now know as much about this supposed romance as Rodney's original jury. Rodney's entire defense was the secret relationship, and he provided almost no evidence to support its existence. So whether or not you think Rodney is guilty, I think we can at least agree that the jury made a reasonable decision with the information it had. Well, some of us can agree. Reed's defenders have a, let's call it an alternative theory about why the jury found Reed guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, journalism. Of course, it's been 2 decades since Rodney was found guilty, and in that time, more people have come forward claiming to have seen Rodney and Stacy together. So the question is whether these testimonies would have made a difference. Let's find out. While there's too many to discuss in any real detail, I've selected a few that Rodney's supporters seem to find convincing, and maybe you will as well. We'll begin with Reed's cousin, Chris Aldridge. Unlike the other post-trial witnesses, Chris was actually prepared to testify at the trial, but Reed's attorney wouldn't allow it. This has led to a lot of speculation on the part of Reed's supporters. Why exactly wasn't he allowed to testify? Was this simple incompetence, or was something more nefarious at play? Or maybe Chris was an erratic dumbass who no attorney in his or her right mind would put on the stand.
Basically, everybody in Bastrop knows about them too. You know, it was a secret, but not a secret. You know what I'm saying? They'd meet up on the north end, or they'll go riding around. And, you know, a couple times I rode with them. You know, all he did is, you know, smoke, you know, laugh, kid, whatever. Then they'll drop me off and go on about their business.
Well, I'd say that clears that up. And just in case you think I'm being too hard on Chris, you should know that he also claims that Rodney and Stacy used to drive around smoking crack. Well, I guess it's good to see couples with similar interests. However, a toxicology report shows that Stacy had used no drugs, crack included, in the 3 months prior to her death. Look, maybe not calling Chris as a witness was part of a grand conspiracy against Rodney. Or maybe Reed's attorney didn't want to put a compulsive liar with a criminal history on the stand to defend her client. Next up is Mellor Marie Aldridge, who claims she was with Rodney at a friend's house when Stacy came to pick him up. Mellor says she knew the woman was Stacy because she drove a full-size pickup, worked at the customer service desk at H-E-B, and was best friends with a Hispanic co-worker named Rose who lived in the projects. Now maybe you're thinking, wow, that's pretty specific. She must have known Stacy really well. And I'd agree. If not for the fact that Fennell's pickup wasn't full-size, Stacy never worked in the customer service department, and Hispanic Rose from the projects appears not to have existed, much less worked at H-E-B. And then there was Elizabeth Keener, a bondswoman and family friend of the Reeds, who often bailed Rodney out of jail. She claims to have seen Reed leaving H-E-B with a, quote, pretty white girl. A few months later, she saw a picture of Stacy in the paper and noted a resemblance between her and the girl she saw with Reed at H-E-B. She later added that a woman named Betty Wallace told her and a man named Chris Hill that Rodney and Stacy's relationship was common knowledge at H-E-B. Yet when asked for a statement, Hill denied knowledge of either the conversation or the relationship. And lastly, we have a former co-worker of Stacy's, Alicia Slater. Alicia claims that Stacy told her, a month before her death, that she was sleeping with a black guy named Rodney.
My name's Alicia Slater, and I worked at the H-E-B in Bastrop from 1995 to 1996 before I graduated high school. I knew Stacy. She was a year or two older than me, and didn't work in the same department or anything. I was just the bagger and the cart girl outside mostly, but we just knew each other through work, and we had lunch together in the break room quite often. We were having lunch in the break room together, and it was just the two of us, and she pretty much was confiding in me. We were talking about her engagement ring, and I was like, oh, are you so excited to get married? And she said she really wasn't so excited to get married, and quickly followed that with saying that she was actually sleeping with a black guy named Rodney, and that she was, not sure what her fiance would do if he found out, and she had to be pretty careful about it. So she wasn't really excited about getting married because she was sleeping with a black dude named Rodney, she said. 100% remember everything about that conversation, and she was scared in a way, and then she was also super happy because she's sleeping with this guy named Rodney, and I didn't know know who Rodney was, didn't know who Jenny was. So, you know, I have zero affiliation to either one of them. I'm not a family member. All I knew was Stacy from work. And all I know is what she told me. And that's all I can, you know, I stand by my word with that.
To believe Alicia's story, you have to believe that Stacy told a random coworker about an affair which she hadn't shared with either her closest friends or family. And where was this information when the police interviewed Alicia back in 1996? HEB even offered a $50,000 reward to anyone with information leading to an arrest. Yet we're expected to believe that she sat on this story for 2 decades? It wasn't until Rodney's case began receiving international media attention, as well as celebrity support, that Alicia magically remembered this incredibly important conversation. And this really is the problem with these so-called witnesses who came forward decades after the fact. Had they come forward at the time, investigators could have, investigated. And it has to be asked whether this is precisely the reason they didn't. Here's the thing. Police picked through Stacy's life for 7 months and never heard a word about Rodney. How was that possible if their relationship was such common knowledge? You can believe what you like, but these witnesses make up some of the best evidence that Reed's defenders have, and their stories are completely uncorroborated. It's highly doubtful that any of them would have made a difference at trial. Let's just be honest. This supposed relationship has never been anything more than a self-serving fabrication. It was the only scenario that explained the presence of Rodney's semen inside of a murdered woman. Well, other than the obvious. Earlier, I briefly mentioned 2 prior sexual assault allegations against Reed when discussing how he became a suspect in Stacy's murder. But Linda Schluter and Caroline Rivas aren't the only women Rodney has been accused of sexually assaulting. In fact, Rodney has been accused of sexual assault no fewer than 7 times. Now, if you've never heard any of this, don't feel too bad. The media and Reed's fan club have largely ignored these allegations. Now keep in mind that only one of these cases has actually been tried in a court. Reed hasn't been found guilty of any of the following accusations. That said, some of them also share some disturbing similarities with Stacy's case. Reed was first charged with sexually assaulting 19-year-old Connie York. Though he initially denied knowing Connie, at trial he had a different defense. He claimed the two had been in a relationship, but that it had to be kept secret because Connie didn't want her parents knowing she was dating a black man. Sound familiar? The difference is that in this case, it was 4 years between the alleged sexual assault and when the case went to trial. The jury believed Reed's story and he was acquitted. After Connie was 12-year-old Angela Hambley, who fell asleep on her couch and woke up to being blindfolded, beaten, and sexually abused. DNA from Angela's rape kit matched Reed, but the case never went to trial because Rodney was sent to death row for murdering Stacy, but the indictment is still pending. Next was Lucy Eper, a former girlfriend of Reed's and mother to 2 of his children. Lucy claims Reed physically abused her throughout their relationship, including while she was pregnant, and that he frequently raped her. One of those times, according to Lucy, was in front of their children. To be fair to Reed, however, Lucy did eventually drop the charges. Following Lucy was Caroline Rivas, Reed's mentally disabled girlfriend whom I mentioned earlier. Rivas' caseworker noticed some bruises on her arms, and after some coaxing, Rivas explained that Reed would hurt her when she refused to have sex. Later, the caseworker noticed that Rivas was walking awkwardly and seemed in pain when sitting down. Rivas explained that Reed had beaten and raped her the night before. Yet again, her rape kit matched Rodney Reed. 6 months before Stacy's murder, Vivian Harbottle was walking home from a bar when she was approached by a man who seemed friendly enough at first. The two sat for a time and spoke, But when Vivian got up to leave, the man grabbed her from behind, threw her to the ground, and raped her. Rodney Reed has been linked to this crime by both Vivian's identification as well as DNA. Unfortunately, however, this hasn't stopped some of Reed's supporters from harassing Vivian for years. She was even forced to involve the police when one of those supporters, convinced she was lying, repeatedly showed up at her work to grill her over her account. This indictment, too, is still pending. And last, of course, was Linda Schluter, whose identification of Rodney ultimately connected him to Stacy's murder. So, to recap, Rodney was arrested after another victim identified him and a DNA test linked him to Stacy's murder. At trial, he claimed to have a secret relationship with Stacy, but provided almost no evidence to support this claim. He was understandably found guilty. Since his trial, Reed's supporters have pushed the notion that Stacy's fiancé, Jimmy Fennell, was the real killer. Yet Fennell was the primary suspect for 7 months after Stacy's death, and investigators found no evidence of his involvement. Despite this, Reed's team has put forward a number of so-called witnesses, including a proven liar with a grudge against Fennell and a former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood with a, well, grudge against Fennell. In addition to the contested semen evidence, Reed's saliva was found on Stacy's breast. And after years of pushing for additional DNA testing, when the state finally agreed, the results only further cemented Reed's guilt. Finally, there's Rodney's troubling history of allegations that we just looked at. Taking all of this into account, the only reasonable conclusion is that Reed is guilty. Of course, Reed's defenders aren't convinced by evidence, but a good story. Those people I don't expect to reach. But for everyone else, I hope this video gives you a better understanding of the facts about the case and why Rodney Reed is exactly where he belongs.